Open your eyes, little one.
Kern admonished as he flew at breakneck speeds.
You need to bear witness to what unfolds.
Anwen opened her eyes as she felt the upsweep of Kern's wings. He seemed to hover in the air as she looked over his arching neck. She was just in time to see a massive spear speed downward from the far side. Had she looked, she would have realized they'd come from an entrance far down the endless chasm. And while the others raced towards the city, Kern headed to the gates where her mother had stayed behind.
Mom!
Her sweaty hands slipped as Kern banked to one side and she felt herself slipping.
No!
Kern charged forward, heading towards the creature towering over the gates.
You dare approach the gates of Tarragon!
He brought his claws to bear when only halfway across the ruined city. Anwen couldn't maintain her hold any longer. She slid from his scales, falling towards the stone below. Just as she thought she'd hit the ground, she felt something close around her. It reminded her of the time she'd fallen off the mountain into the endless chasm. Looking up, she realized that, once again, Tyler had saved her life. Holding onto his claws, she focused on the direction where Kern had flown.
Mom! I need to call to her, please!
Sensing her fear, Tyler changed course and sped towards the gates. He dropped her at the head of the pathway leading up to the gates before going to join his brother and the Nurrim above them.
Mom! Mom!
Anwen ran ahead, the key banging against her chest as she moved.
Mom!
Tears hit the ground as she ran. With pounding heart, Anwen rounded the last bend to see her mother lying to one side. Margo's face and shirt were covered with blood. There was a long gash down her arm. Anwen dropped down by her mother's side, cradling her head in her arms. She sobbed. It took Anwen a moment to realize Madame Millard's body had pinned her mother down. She tried to push the heavy-set woman aside. It took a lot more effort than she'd thought possible. The woman was solid, even in death, but she finally managed to free her mother from the other woman's remains and pulled her into her arms. Margo coughed as the pressure was released from her crushed rib cage. Blood dribbled from her lips.
Little one.
She half whispered as she stared at skyward, a look of wonder in her eyes.
You did it. You did it.
Her eyes went glassy as her body went growing heavier in Anwen's arms. Anwen pulled back a little, staring in horror. She shook her head, voice hoarse.
No! Mom!
Tears rolled freely from her face as she pulled her mother back up into her arms, but Margo was gone.
No!
Her anguished cry filled the air. The weight of her burden began to change, and she looked down in horror. Her mother's body was glowing. Light shone from her like it was coming from behind shattered glass. Afraid, Anwen set her mother down and edged away, trying to distance herself. Her progress was stopped when she ran into Madame Millard's still form. As she watched, Margo's body seemed to fly apart in a flurry of matter. The matter swirled around the enclosed area. It glowed a brilliant green, reminding Anwen of young plants in spring. As though comprised of thousands of tiny fireflies, the energy swarmed. It then converged around Anwen's shaking form. For the briefest of moments, it reformed into the image of her mother. Unbidden, Anwen raised her hand as if to caress it. She thought she felt her mother return the gesture. As she raised her hand, the ring she wore flashed. The swirling mass of energy streamed towards the ring as if compelled by a magnetic force. The stone blazed with a blinding light that only intensified as the particles all but flew into it. As the last vestiges of energy entered the ring, the rest of Margo's body faded away, as if only a wisp of smoke. Anwen clenched her fists as she bowed over the empty space. When she raised her head, an even more anguished cry ripped from her throat. Tears fell like rain, further blinding her. Overhead, Kern charged at the creature that had once been Kira. His massive claws shredded at air as the revenant moved out of the way. It sprouted massive wings, beating them back. Tyler dived in for the next attack, trying to come down from the opposite side. Kira only dodged, almost causing the two dragons to collide with each other. The demon's laughter filled the air as they continued to attack. Every now and then a chunk of what looked like dark stone flew from the revenant's body, but it didn't slow her down. She reached out with large claws, almost sketching a series of dark lines down Tyler's flank. He managed to get out of the way at the last possible second, Callum coming to his side. The air was suddenly rent with the sound of Anwen's anguished cries, and Tyler faltered. Kira took advantage of that moment to knock him from the sky. He went crashing down towards the stones below. Hearing the loud thud, Anwen looked up to see what was going on. She couldn't help but cry out as Tyler's draconic form rolled down the mountain's side.
Tyler!
Her mouth twisted in horror as she stared through reddened eyes. As she peered upward to see the other dragons, the Revenant filled her view. Pain sprang into life inside her body, and she screamed as it paralyzed her. She fell to the ground in agony. Kern had no time to turn to see what caused the anguish of his youngest grandchild. Kira made another swipe at him with her gnarled fingers. Talons raked upwards to pierce anything they could touch. He dove, tucking his wings to sweep around her form. He reached out his claws at the last possible moment to tear across her back. Callum swooped in from the other side. Tyler lulled to one side as he came to a stop down in the city. He stared at the sky as fire lanced through his body. Raw fire. He let out a loud bugle of pain as his vision threatened to fragment on him. He panted heavily from his own efforts and the connection he shared with Anwen. She was in trouble, and there was nothing he could do about it. Anwen felt as though over 1,000 volts of electricity were coursing through her body. Sweat beaded up all over her as she writhed in agony. Above, thunder continued to crash across the sky as lightning ripped through the stratosphere. Rain began to fall heavily to the ground, coating everything in slippery mud and tears. From around Anwen's neck, the crystal key glowed like foxfire. The ring on her finger only added to the pool of light around her. There was something important about that light, but she couldn't make her mind work. What was it about the light? It was almost as if it were trying to remind her of something. But what was she forgetting? The pain was almost too much to bear. Images swam before her eyes. Memories that had been shaken loose when she'd eaten the diviner's sage. Images of Tyler. Images of Courtney and Walter. And her mother. What was so important about them?
Somewhere out there is a dragon who is madly in love with you.
The sudden recollection of those words jolted her and she lay still. With eyes wide open, she felt that same warmth from inside the mountain began to spread through her body. Love? Is that the answer? Did Tyler love her? She saw herself in the mountain, being crushed by the collapsed cavern that had claimed Daphne's life. And there was Tyler, pawing at the rubble like a man possessed. When he'd uncovered her body, he cradled her in his arms like she was something precious. And then she saw him lay her body on the ground as he gathered his energy into one point. Light filled her vision, pure, white light so bright she had to close her eyes.
What the mountain gave to me, now I give to you.
His words echoed through her mind as the warmth increased. She felt as though her entire body was glowing. The energy that coursed through her subdued the pain from the soul scars. When Anwen opened her eyes, she found she was standing. The crystal key was in her hand, only it had elongated into a sword. And she was shouting words she was sure she didn't know. Lightning flashed around her like she was in a cage of the electrical energy. One bolt struck the tip of the sword, arcing out around her as fire rained down around them. Tyler felt the pain suddenly lift from his body and he rolled to regain his footing. Hearing Anwen's voice, he moved towards her, but paused. A pillar of fire seemed to envelop her as she wielded the Keeper's sword, pointing it towards the sky. Out of the corner of his eye, Tyler saw Kern, Callum, and Kira also pause as though dazzled by the light. They clung to the craggy tops of the mountain, mesmerized by the light display below. Kira let out a screech of outrage as the pillar of fire spread from around Anwen's standing form. For the first time in her life, she felt fear.
You will die!
She made to launch herself at the lone girl but stumbled. White-hot light stabbed through her, immobilizing her as Anwen pointed the blade at her. She screamed in defiance. Kern took that moment to tear great chunks from her body. He sent them tumbling down like giant boulders that rolled across the city below. Seeing Callum attacking the creature from the other side, Tyler went to join him. The light continued to build inside the demon as they tore great blocks of stone from her decaying body. From inside her shell, red light coalesced into a pool where her heart might have once been.
Turn away!
Kern called out to his kinsman as the revenant began to crack with blasts under pressure. He shielded himself with his wings as he fell to the ground. Tyler and Callum did the same. With a sudden onrush of air, the revenant exploded into thousands of shattered pieces. The resulting fragments rained down on the courtyards below. Dragons flung up their wings to protect each other. The flying debris came down like miniature comets invading the sky. Screams of pain escaped many leathery lips as the hot shards stung and burned scales and hides. One dragon pulled Courtney and Walter under its protective wing. More debris rained down where they'd been standing only moments before. Overhead, the clouds seemed to lighten. They returned to a more normal state as the skies wept on the scene below. Tyler soared over the mountain as he peered down at where Anwen stood. He landed on the path leading towards her. Noticing her arm wavering under the weight of the sword, he sprang forward to try and catch her. He transformed as he ran, reaching her as she crumpled into his arms, the blade falling to the ground. Tyler's mortal legs collapsed under him, and he sat down heavily. Anwen lay cradled against his chest, eyes closed. He pressed one hand against her wet hair, stroking it.
Please.
He kept whispering over and over again. He could hear her heart beating slower than his more frantic one, and held her all the more tightly for it.
Please!
Anwen groaned slightly as she opened her eyes.
What are you doing here?
The Dragon Lord smiled as he loosened his grip.
We really need to stop meeting like this.
He gazed lovingly down at her dirt-streaked face.
It's not good for either of our health.
Anwen couldn't help but laugh. She leaned against his chest, shaking as her laughter turned to tears, the grief moving to the forefront of her thoughts. She sobbed.
He's gone.
Tyler pulled her closer, bending over her to kiss her hair.
I know, Anwen. I know.